Welcome to EdLeader with your host, Dr. Rob Jackson. Join Dr. Jackson for conversations and reflections on improving educational leadership from the classroom to the boardroom and beyond. Educational leadership is an ever-evolving opportunity to make a real and lasting difference in the lives of students, parents, and the community. And now, here's your host, Dr. Rob Jackson.
Hi friends, welcome to the 10th episode of EdLeader. I'm your host, Rob Jackson, and I want to thank you for spending time with me today. I'm incredibly excited about the amazing growth of the EdLeader community. I hope that you are finding true value in our time together. If you haven't, please take a moment to subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcast, Google Play, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Stitcher, or your favorite podcast player. You may find show notes for each episode at drrobjackson.com. We have a great show today. Let's get to it. I am so incredibly excited about our guest today. He is currently an innovative teaching, learning, and leadership consultant, speaker, as well as the author of 2 books that are absolutely touchstone text for my practice. The first is The Innovator's Mindset. Most recently, he wrote Innovate Inside the Box. He's a former division principal of innovative teaching and learning with the Parkland School District, located in Stony Plain, Alberta, Canada, has over 20 years of experience as an educator in a myriad of roles from K-12, and is absolutely passionate about distributed leadership. He is Mr. Innovation. I am so excited to share with you someone who says by being curious, collaborative, and open to new learning, we can truly inspire our students to not only be prepared for the real world, but ensure that they make the world better than it is now. This is the work that drives what I do. He is George Couros, my first international guest and one of my go-tos in terms of the podcast I listen to. Welcome, George.
Hey, Rob. Thanks for having me today.
Absolutely. It is an incredible honor to have the opportunity to have a conversation with you. One of the things that I do want to share with you is I've had the opportunity to hear you speak on several occasions. And each time I've left that moment feeling a little bit convicted because you're pushing me in my thinking each time I hear you. And as I read your blog and read your books and listen to your podcast, and I appreciate that. But one of the things I was convicted about was that I've had an idea about doing a podcast for a couple of years. And the last time I heard you was actually on the Outer Banks of northeastern North Carolina. And I decided in that moment it was time to get this done. And so this podcast exists in part because of your encouragement. So thank you for that.
That's awesome. That's cool. Yeah. And I hope that I try to push people to try new things, but I also hopefully people see that I am trying some myself. And you probably started your podcast, and I think I just started a podcast right after you because, like I said, trying to, especially in the work that we do in education, we have to model that willingness to learn. It's not just to absorb information, but to actually create new ideas and share that out with people. So I appreciate you modeling the way.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate that. And I was extremely excited when you started your podcast. And for our listeners, it's called the Innovator's Mindset, the podcast. You started it, and I think one of the things we share in common is a love of running, or at least we enjoy running. And so I do quite a bit of running. That's my best time to think and reflect. And I really enjoy on Sunday afternoons when your podcast comes out. It just makes my afternoon as I'm preparing for the week, listening to you and your thinking. And so thank you for that as well.
Yeah, it's awesome. It's interesting because there's some times where I make sure I do not listen to education stuff. I stay away from it, and probably running would be one of those spaces that I would listen to something that had to do with sports or just listen to music, when I drive. I listen to a lot of podcasts, but not many during my downtime on education. And I think for me, that's actually a really important thing that I do, because I do speak about education often. I write about it quite a bit. Now the podcast, that we need to, I think as educators and leaders, we need to step away from it. It's just kind of have an understanding of what's going on around the rest of the world and bringing that in. Because I think if we become too school focused too often, we kind of lose sight of why we do what we do that has to actually do with outside of our buildings, and really tapping that in. But I don't know how you run while listening to education podcasts, because I probably would break down and start crying half the time. So, yeah.
Well, that's why I try to find podcasts that encourage me as opposed to.
That's good. Yeah.
You're absolutely right. And one of the things that certainly we've had the opportunity to talk about on the podcast is self-care and the importance of taking care of our own well-being. A recent guest said something about it's hard to serve others when our own bowl is empty. And so running and really getting out there into the world becomes important.
Yeah, for sure. And one of the things that I've really tried to do, and obviously I use a lot of social media, I blog, tweet, podcast, things like that. But I also try to stay away from it first thing in the morning, because, you'll see you get like a negative email, you see a negative tweet, and it could totally shift the direction of your day. And I want to start off, where I've accomplished some things, personally, whether it's lifting, weightlifting, exercise, some running, things like that. But it's something that I really have strived to do, because I know that I'm guilty of, getting up in the morning, planning to work out, getting sucked into Twitter. 2 hours later, I've done nothing but look on the phone. So I think it's actually a really good model for our kids too, that if you actively use these things, but also show that you actually do other things as well.
Right.
So I can always say to a kid, I use social media, I do all these things, but I also do these things that, provides you some insight. So I'm not totally focused on that as well. So I think it's something for me that I'm really cognizant of. Like, for example, like this podcast, we're doing this at noon, my time. And I have a very hard rule that when I'm home, because I don't get to be home that often, that I do not do anything before noon, that it's my family time and it's my personal time. And I stick to that. So if people can't fit into that, then it just doesn't seem to work. Yeah. Cause I have to make sure that I have that time with especially, with my family, my daughter, but also get that time to kind of settle. And then I'm actually feel like I'm ready to go for the rest of the day too. Right.
Excellent. Well, and speaking of being ready to go, that's the perfect segue to the first thing I want to kind of talk about. And that's something that you talked about in the last time I heard you speak, this incredible thing that you did with your daughter prior to her being born. You set up for her an email account, and I'd like you to kind of talk about that a little bit, because as you were doing that, I was sitting there going, man, I wish I had done that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so there's a really great, it's actually a Google commercial from years ago. It's called Dear Sophie. And what a dad basically did was they set up an email account. Now, I assume, I haven't really dug into it, but because to be honest with you, it's more the idea than if it's factual or not, because it's so simple to do. But a dad set up an email account for his daughter, and what he actually does, he emails basically her life through his eyes and shares little messages, and throughout you can actually see her growing up. And it's just a really powerful thing. So I actually did set that up for my daughter, Clea. We're actually having another daughter coming up soon, and I'll be doing the exact same thing. And I think it's really a really powerful way for not only to share my thoughts to my daughter, as she's growing up, but to kind of archive things. And what's neat is that she is 3.5 years old. She'll be 4 in August. And what we've started to do is she will get into videos with me, and she's not going to remember this, right? Which is kind of the point, where we actually send her emails. And so she'll say something to herself in the future, and then she'll write on my phone. Now, she doesn't know how to, spell English right now. So I'll ask her, what did that say? And then I'll translate it to her in the future. So it's a really cool thing. It's actually something that I didn't really expect to. I knew I was going to do it for my daughter. I didn't expect to do it with my daughter, which is kind of neat. So I think it's kind of a neat way to, share her impact on me growing up and some of the trials and tribulations, if you will, that we're going through, as she gets older.
It's such a powerful practice. My children are all in their early 20s, and so I missed out on that opportunity. But one day, if I'm blessed with grandkids, I've decided that
I'm either going
Absolutely.
to be doing it for my grandchildren or encouraging my own children to do it for theirs. But speaking of your daughter, and I believe you said you're expecting another daughter.
Yeah, we're expecting a daughter in May. So
Congratulations.
thank you.
Congratulations. Well, speaking of your daughters, I know that you are a big fan of the Lakers. And
Yes.
recently, of course, Kobe Bryant, along with others, passed away. And in his passing, a lot was shared about the importance of being a hashtag girl dad.
Yeah.
I know that you actually had a dog named Kobe, and so you've been
Yeah.
a fan for a long time. And
Yeah.
as you've worked around innovation, I wonder, as you've had the opportunity to kind of reflect on one of your sports heroes who's passed, what's your takeaway from the way he approached the game or life or being a dad? Just what's your Kobe Bryant takeaway?
Well, it's actually interesting because I was in LA. I actually was in the area where Kobe lived for an event the day before, and I was flying out, and I got to the airport, and I found out probably about 30 minutes before what happened. And it was silence. It was the weirdest. I've been to LAX several times, and it was just quiet. And, I'm a huge basketball fan. I've been a huge Lakers fan since I was a kid. But I think for me, it was really, it was devastating as a fan. But I think when I heard that his daughter died with him, that took it to just a whole different level. And it really is still shaken me. I remember coming home because I was not home for a few days, and my daughter wondering why I'm like hugging her nonstop, for a few days after. But the one thing that I think really made me think a lot is that I actually, when Kobe Bryant retired, I actually saw his retirement where they retired his jersey. I was actually at that game. I didn't think he would be capable of retiring. I honestly did not think he could walk away from basketball. What I saw is that he took on these other endeavors, but he became such a dad. And literally the day before I was with a group, and they were telling me about how Kobe Bryant was coaching his daughter's basketball team. I'm like, what are you talking about? And I didn't know that. And now, like, everyone knows that now because of all the news. And I just heard about it, like how excited, how he was always there. He was so excited to coach his daughter and be a part of that. And I think for me, the worst part about the whole thing is this person puts in all this effort, all this work to basically master their craft. And then when they get to, enjoy the time to be with their family, that time is cut unbelievably short. So it's really made me think a lot about, the time when I'm home, what I do, how I make sure that I interact and make sure I make families. Like I'm very, like, I believe I have a really hard, I have a hard work ethic, but I know sometimes it's taken away from things that it shouldn't have. And I think that's really been what struck me. Like the basketball thing, yeah, it's amazing. And he's an incredible basketball player, but I think it really more from the perspective of a dad. I think that to me is where it's really struck me.
So that's so incredibly powerful, George. And really to go from there, as educators, we tend to just pour ourselves into the work, and it's hard for us to pull ourselves back. I mentioned my children are in their early 20s, and one of the regrets I have is that I didn't spend enough time with my own children because I was spending so much time with everyone else's children. Now, my kids grew up in the schoolhouse, probably like yours. They were in my classroom helping me put together my classroom. And as a principal, they were running up and down the halls and playing in the gym. And so they would say that they had a good life. But as I look back, I wish that I had done what you're clearly doing, which is prioritizing them. And it is sad, and to kind of extend that, when we see an educator who works for many, many years, decades, finally gets to retire, and then their life is cut short and they miss out on that opportunity to enjoy the good life. And so I do think there's a powerful message there around prioritizing family and taking care of ourselves.
Yeah, actually, as a principal, one of the things that I used to really get on my teachers for, and I know it's going to sound weird, is if they were at school too late. I would really bother me that people were putting in, I don't know if I didn't have an issue with the effort. I had an issue with, not having outside interests. And I think personally, that's not necessarily good for a teacher in a way to connect with kids. But I also think that if you're over planning as a teacher, you might be doing more learning than the kids are. And so how do you create those opportunities? And so I think it's always been something that I felt is really important as an administrator, but I also know that I haven't modeled it well in the past. that I really push my teachers to spend time with family, have outside interests, but then I didn't necessarily model that well. And I think I'm getting better at that, but it's still something that I want to do. And I always had this plan that, I want to be able to coach my daughters. And I think that's what shook me, is that I've planned, 5-6 years in advance. Like, I'm going to be done doing this so I can do that. But you're not guaranteed that time. So
that's right.
I'm trying to make sure that I do everything right now.
And I've kind of laughed when you talked about coaching your daughters, because in a recent podcast, you were talking about your coaching experience and yelling at referees. And so you changed. You said you changed from yelling at referees because a referee actually mentioned to you that children were modeling themselves after your actions. And so I can imagine if your daughters are on the team, you really be careful in how you act as a coach.
Yeah, that was like, I always wanted to, like I said, I've been watching basketball since I was a kid. It's really shaped a lot of who I am, the ability to work in teams, leadership, things like that, communication. But yeah, I was notoriously bad my first, probably 3 months of yelling at referees, because that's what I watch NBA coaches do. And, we didn't really get much living in Canada. You got the rare NBA game because it's all about hockey. And if you went hockey, it'd be even worse probably for yelling at referees. And so I remember the referee, basically, who I knew was a colleague, basically shared that, hey, like, and I was wondering, I'm like, why are my students yelling? I'm like, oh, it's because I'm yelling, right?
It's like encouraging the teachers to prioritize family life and do other things.
Exactly.
The do as I say, not as I do, it just never works. We really have to model what we're expecting to see.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's hopefully, I noticed that once I, being more thoughtful. And the other thing too, and this is like not only refereeing, because I actually reffed for several years, but people that yelled all the time and were whiny, you just didn't even listen to them anymore. And I remember one time we went into, every time we would ref a basketball game, I thought it was really interesting. We would always talk about the coaches, like what we knew about the coaches, like what is this person like, how are they going to be? And I remember one referee comments about a coach, and it's always stuck with me. They said, if this coach says anything to you, it's valid, because they don't say anything. So if they do, it's valid. And so I've really tried to kind of embrace that, that really, when you share things, that I'm not just kind of harping on the same thing over and over again, where my voice becomes, just background noise. That when I do share something, hopefully it's, important, because I'm thoughtful and I try to listen a lot more than I speak.
Absolutely. As my grandmother would say, that would preach, George, that would preach. Really thoughtful about not speaking all the time just to be speaking or to hear ourselves.
Right. Absolutely.
Really being thoughtful. Speaking of being thoughtful, one of the things, and of course out of many, that you were sharing that really kind of stuck with me and had really been kind of dwelling on for a few weeks now, you were sharing your own journey and reflecting about traditional practice versus innovation. And so as you were talking about that and your mindset shift around that, that's something that I've also been kind of reflecting on. But share with us, as you kind of thought about traditional practice in relation to innovation, kind of how your own thinking has changed over time.
I'm really reflective on practice. I think blogging, podcasting are really valuable too. And I think a lot of people get sucked into the idea of like blogging and podcasting to get their message out there and to share ideas. And sometimes, to be honest with you, to make a name for themselves. And it's never been a focus for me. I blog and podcast because when I know that I share openly and people will see what I'm sharing, that I'm very thoughtful of it. And it's really helped me to become a really reflective practitioner. And I think that to me is the crux of what I do. I don't write for clicks, and maybe that's to my detriment sometimes, but it's never been something that I've really focused on. But I think a lot of people appreciate the vulnerability they share.
Absolutely.
Reflection. And so one of the things that I know that I've changed in my language is not using the term traditional in lieu of bad. So, like, oh, we're really stuck with these traditional teachers. And you hear that all the time in education, by the way, right? Like they are saying these are bad teachers because they do something the way they've done. And what I've shifted is to really think about the idea of traditional practice versus bad practice and how those are different things. Now, there are some traditional practices that I believe are bad.
Right.
And I don't know, in Canada, like, I know a traditional practice that is very bad that, probably was in the US as well. We used to hit kids. That was actually a traditional practice forever. And we know that's a bad practice.
That's
So I don't know. I used to get hit as a kid, as a student. And I know that's crazy. And the crazy thing is that the teachers would actually call home and say, we hit your kid today. And my parents would be like, oh, like what did he do? Right. It was seen as actually something you should do. Is crazy. Right. And now we know that's a horrible thing to do, as parents and as kids. And so I think it's really kind of making sure those are separate. And the example I use of traditional practice of being really good is storytelling. I do focus a lot of times when I speak to share stories, because stories are what resonate with people. That's what gets people their ideas to stick. And that's storytelling is probably the oldest practice of teaching and learning, in existence, and people still use it effectively to this day. So I think it's really kind of revisiting. But that being said, I don't want people using that idea that we should, traditional practice is not bad. Bad practice is what I'm focused on. But there are traditional practices that I've challenged that I don't think are great for kids that we do without thinking about it. Like, for example, I'm not a huge fan of award ceremonies and how we do individual awards, especially when we're trying to get people to be critical and creative thinkers, and then really awarding the people that actually are the best rule followers. It's kind of, counterintuitive. We talk about collaboration all the time in schools, but then when a lot of schools I go to, they have, top individual awards. They don't focus on these things. So I think it's asking the question, is this practice we've been doing for years still a relevant and good practice? And sometimes it's yes, and sometimes it's no. And sometimes there's classroom level things, or sometimes there's school and district level things, but we have to not just associate traditional with bad, but still not stick with something just because we've done it.
Right. And I love your definition of innovation, which is innovation is new and better. And that is really centered on being reflective as a practitioner and looking for, is there something that I could do better? Because I want to help my students be as successful as possible. And I'm willing to change if change is what needs to happen for our students' sake. And so it comes back to that reflection, doesn't it?
Well, I think that the other part of it too, I think that's really important, is understanding that on the flip side, not all new practice is actually good for kids, right? And there's things that you're seeing that I challenge quite often in education that I'm seeing as what is deemed as innovative practice. It's simply new, but I don't necessarily think it's better. And so I think that's where we have to kind of draw that line. That if a traditional practice works for a kid or a new practice works for a kid, that's the question. It's just not that we're using what we used to use, or we're trying to do new things for the sake of doing new things. It's always about, does this actually serve the kids in front of us?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, George, I could talk to you all day, but I promised I'd be mindful of your time. And so if you don't mind, I'd like to ask you one last question.
You got it. Yeah.
Excellent. And I didn't intend to spend as much time talking about our children and basketball, but that's the power of conversation. And so I very much appreciate the conversation we've had.
You've got mail.
Just when everything is going perfectly, someone makes a choice that lands squarely on your desk. What will you do, and how will you handle it? It's time to check the inbox.
Oh, George, there's the bell. That means we have an inbox scenario for you. George, for some reason, you've just been appointed to return to the principalship. You are a principal going into a school that has been successful, doing pretty well, and it's your job to look at the practices of the school and determine what's the way forward. As you begin to work with the staff, what are you really looking at the school in terms of guiding your path as the principal in that school as you enter?
Yeah, I think for me, one of the things I'm asked often about, if I, in this exact scenario, if you were to be a principal, what's the question usually is, what's the first thing you would change? Like if you went to a new school, what's the first thing you would change? And my answer is always the same: nothing. I would absolutely change nothing. My first role as an administrator, as a leader, walking into a new building where I don't know anyone, I don't know kind of the practices, don't know what's happening in that school, is to go into that school and just observe and kind of sit back and figure out what's going on. And more than that, it's not going out and looking for what's wrong. It's actually looking at what's going really well. Because I think a lot of times when people, and teachers are terrified of this, and for good reason, everyone seems to be trying to make their mark when they go into a new building. Some people are trying to make a name for themselves. And they go in, saying like, hey, we need to do this, we need to do this, we need to do this. And you're not actually putting any value on all the things that have been going on that have been really well at that space. And so I think what I always tell people, I know this is a really specific thing, but the first thing I would do is literally have a spreadsheet with every staff member's name on it. And what I would do is throughout my time of observing, I'd be able to write a column to the right and basically say what their strength is. And until I can identify the strength of every person in that organization, and I think this is really important aspect, until they know I can identify, because I think the shift that we have to have in education is not simply valuing people, but people know their value. Because we can say we value people all we want, but if they don't feel valued, it doesn't really matter. And I think, it's easy to say that, but it's harder to do. And so I think that, to me, that's where I would actually start, is actually looking at what is going on, what is going really well, starting there. And then you start moving people forward. And I think it's much easier to move people forward when they know their value, but if they don't feel valued, they will fight you the entire way. And I think, I do want to make, every organization, every person I interact with better in some way. But I think for me, it's really starting with, what are they doing really well? What can I learn from this person? What strengths do they already bring to the table? I think what's weird is that people feel that might take too much time to change a culture. But if you're fighting with people all the time, it's going to take forever. But if I spend some time just learning about them and building those strengths, it's going to move much quicker.
Absolutely. And I tell you what, everything you just said absolutely resonates with my experience and my passion to really look at a school and an educator from a strengths-based perspective. What are you doing well? And let me tell that story, back to the storytelling, to our community about our strengths, really helps us. And it really helps us become a part of the culture and be accepted as a leader, I think, going in.
I think part of it too is that you're trying to model what you'd expect from your teachers, how they interact with students, right? Mm-hmm. Teachers get a new crop of students every single year, and I'd much rather them look first what the kids in front of them can do as opposed to what they can't do, because they're going to have the same benefit. And if that's a thing that we know as educators, we know that's a beneficial practice, has been proven over and over again. Yet I see school districts, media, all these other places talk about what teachers can't do, and then we wonder why they focus on what kids' weaknesses are, because it's getting hammered into them that this is how we do things here. So I think really you're doing this not only to move people forward, but also to model what you'd expect from, your staff in the classrooms.
Absolutely. And speaking of what they can do and what you can do is encourage educators really around the world, because you certainly have encouraged me in many opportunities, and you push my thinking, and I believe I'm a better educator because of your influence. And so I want to thank you. I can't imagine the courage it takes to step away from what we know, the schoolhouse, working in the district, to do this incredible work. But I want to say thank you for doing it, for taking the time to be vulnerable, for sharing your thoughts through the blog and the podcast and through speaking, because that's really making a difference.
Thank you so much for doing this, and I appreciate you taking the time to put this together and put your thoughts out there. So I know it's quite a jump. I know I get nervous when I do podcasting still, but kudos to you for leading the way.
Thank you.
I hope that you enjoyed our time together with George Couros. I really appreciated when he said that traditional teaching does not mean bad teaching. Bad teaching is bad teaching. You can follow George at GCouros on Twitter or at georgecouros.ca on the internet. His books, The Innovator's Mindset and Innovating Inside the Box, are well worth the read. When you're subscribing to the EdLeader podcast, remember you can find his podcast, The Innovator's Mindset, there as well. Thank you for spending time with me today, and thank you for all that you do for every student, every teacher, and every staff member. You are making a difference. If no one else has told you, I want you to know that I believe in you. Good day.
Thank you for listening to the EdLeader podcast. Please subscribe to the podcast and consider leaving a review with 5 stars on Apple Podcasts so that we may continue to grow the EdLeader community. We hope that you have enjoyed your time with Dr. Jackson. Until next time.